All right, if you have your Bibles, you don't have to turn very far. We'll get there momentarily. You can turn to Genesis 1. So it shouldn't take you very long to get there. But I'm excited about the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure how long this will take us, but I have the privilege of introducing us all to the next three studies or ologies in our systematic theology study that we're doing together. And that is, of course, man, sin, and salvation. I wanted to use the fancy words, but I figured I'd use the simple words. So the fancy words are anthropology, hamartiology, and soteriology. Those are the fancy words we'll explain and go on and so forth. But essentially what we're talking about here is the doctrine of man, mankind. That's men and women, not just men. So the doctrine of humans, the doctrine of sin, and the doctrine of salvation. These, of course, are easily lumped together, and it makes sense to keep them together just because they are a unit. Your understanding of humanity and humanity's problem will greatly influence how you understand that problem is remedied, how that problem is fixed. And I would also say that maybe you don't know this consciously, or maybe you've never really thought about this before, but your anthropology, your view of fellow human beings, so to speak, will greatly influence just how you view... I always forget that I have slides. Your anthropology will greatly influence your hamartiology and will affect your soteriology. So, an easier way of saying that is how you understand your place within creation, along with that of your fellow man, will greatly influence your view of man's problem and how that problem is remedied. And this is why this is relevant. This is why this is so important for us to consider, because all of these things go together, just like all of the things we've been studying so far in these ologies, these studies of systematic theology. All of them are building on one another, and each one influences and permeates and affects the other in really, really vital ways. And these disciplines are no less important than any of the others we've covered so far. They're vital to our understanding of who God is. They're vital to what we would say is our quote-unquote theology. And I think this is really important because even if you haven't thought about it before, you have an anthropology. You have a way in which you view fellow human beings that affects how, either you interact with them, how you think about them. Just think about your first reaction when you see a human being on social media. Either they're screwing up, either they're saying something dumb, either they're doing something online that generates a reaction. Where's that coming from? Maybe it's because they're doing something dumb, but also it's because, more likely than not, you have an anthropology that is also filtering that person's words, actions, so on and so forth. And so that what I'm trying to get us to see is that anthropology, that view of human beings that you have all around us, and we're surrounded by human beings all the time, may or may not be biblical, may or may not be how God has told us to interact or respond to our fellow man. Your view of human beings informs how you respond to them, and this is formed, of course, through information and or through experience. You have this view of other people, of others that are surrounding you, that is formed either by information that you've gathered, by things that you've read, or so on and so forth, or it's just by experience. I know that this person cannot be trusted because I've experienced opportunities to where I've been the victim of their mistrust, or so on and so forth. It's by experience. But what I really want to say and ask you is this, because anthropology is not one of the most ooh, this is exciting, we get to talk about humans. We got really excited when Pastor Eric was talking about angels and demons, and I understand that. It's really fascinating, it's really exciting. Humans is not quite as that doesn't get us excited. But I actually think that this is really extremely relevant for us. And I think it's relevant for us to consider all of these facets, especially all of these three together, man, sin, and salvation, because I think they're relevant for evangelism. Let me just take you to the text that we're going to be talking about a lot in this beginning portion. in the weeks to come. But of course, it's Genesis 1, 26 and 27, which is, of course, the creation of man within the creation account of Genesis 1. And notice what happens, or notice notice how this creation of man is described. Let's say it that way. Verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Now, this is going to be one of those open-ended questions, and I make no apologies for asking it. What is one of the things, when you're reading these verses, what's one of the immediate things that stands out to you? There's no really wrong answer. I just want to, what's the thing that's jumping out, either from the page or from the screen? What's one of the things that's jumping out to you when you read this? Us. Oh, in verse 26? Yeah, that's a great point. This is, by the way, this is not part of this, but this is a great point. Notice all of the plural pronouns that appear here, which again are alluding to the Trinity. Let us make man in our image. Again, this is one of those, if someone is trying to convince you that the Bible doesn't convey the fact that God is 3 in 1, take them right here. Because this is exactly where we're going. This is God, Jehovah, having, we could call it a Trinitarian conversation. And he's saying, between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, let's just make man in our image. And this is how man is created. It's a great point. This is a great place to take people if they want to question the Trinity. I would take them here, and I would take them Matthew chapter 3 when Jesus is baptized. But anyways, we're not talking about the Trinity today. But we can if you want to. What else stands out to you? Beard.
Speaking of not the Trinity, but a Trinity, verse 27 says the same thing 3 times.
Created man in his own image?
Created.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's the image. That's a great point. That it's included 3 times in verse 27. Created man in his own image, in the image of God, male and female, he created them. Anything else? Just trying to gauge. Yeah, Pastor Eric?
Yeah, that we're made in the image of God.
Yeah, that's the one I was going with. See, we're on the same
right.
wavelength. In our image. This, of course, is alluding to the idea, and we're going to explain this a little bit later. This is the idea that within you, within every single human being, is what is called the imago Dei, the image of God. Every human has been implanted, has been created with the imago Dei, the image of God, whether that person knows God or not, whether that person believes in Jehovah God from the Bible or not. That's kind of beside the point. The point is that human beings are created in the image of God. And I would say, so again, to bring this full circle, the reason why your anthropology is both doctrinally and evangelistically relevant is because every human being is an image bearer. So this isn't only important for doctrine, what you believe, but evangelism, how you go out and witness that doctrine, because doctrine that just stays with you, belief that just stays with you, that's pointless. Doesn't really do anything for anyone. Doctrine that's lived out, that's evangelism. When you're going out and you're living amongst fellow human beings, you can also understand them as fellow image bearers. And this then creates a whole new level of seriousness, of urgency, I think of care, of compassion and consideration, because that person that cuts you off in traffic is not just a jerk who wants to get to Chipotle before you. No, that's a fellow image bearer of God that also deserves your compassion and your kindness. And you could apply that same scenario to any other scenario in which you find yourself where you're frustrated with a human being. Especially the human beings we see online. You're scrolling, I can't believe what that person did. They are a human being. And as I will hopefully explain this morning, is that they're probably a human being that they themselves have a bad anthropology, which has then gone on and affected all of the ways in which they've gone into all kinds of crazy beliefs. The point I want to convey to you again this morning is that these studies of these ologies, man, sin, and salvation, of course, are greatly impactful for our daily life, how we view the people that we live with all the time. How can we not be tenacious or urgent with our testimony when we realize that our neighbors, our friends, those grocery store people that are around us were also made in the image of God. And I would say this, that with a proper biblical view of our fellow human beings around us and their problems, which is, of course, sin, that is going to help us be better equipped to not only understand them, but also understand, again, that the only solution, the only remedy for their problem is the gospel, God's salvation. So again, all of this is still gospel-centered stuff. We're going to get into some different places than we normally get into, but this is all very gospel-centered and all very, would say, relevant to where we are on a daily basis. So, a quick outline of where we're going to go. We're going to start out with anthropology. We're going to start out talking about talking about man himself, the creation of man, definitions. We're going to define all that. We're going to talk about man's origin. We're going to talk about man's place, and then we're going to talk about man's nature. And this is going to segue us easily into hamartiology, the doctrine of sin, because man's nature has been affected, tainted, it's been twisted by sin. So all of this is going to flow into one another as we keep going through this study. So that's kind of a quick overview of where we're going to go. Once again, I make no apologies for this. I'm going to turn your attention to the State of Theology survey. I always like to turn people to this only because it gives us a really amazing snapshot, as I've said on a couple of occasions, of where the United States specifically is. This survey, of course, I'll reiterate once again, is conducted by Legan Ministries and Lifeway Research. Really responsible survey houses, if you will. They handle data information well, and both of them are very much in our same sort of Christian circles, if you will. But they conduct this survey every 2 years. I can't wait to see the 2024 one that comes out hopefully soon. But this is based on the 2022 survey results in the United States. They also do it in the United Kingdom, but regardless. So State of Theology survey number 8. So, by the way, there's a list of I think it's 30-something statements, and it's just a broad reaction from people of all kinds of different demographics. Statement number 8 says this: God created male and female. We are doing pretty good on this one. I'm really glad for this response. 98% of evangelicals agreed. 2%, not sure where they're going or what's happening with the other 2%. But we're going to call this a win. Based on other ones that I've seen out there, and especially based on the next one I'm going to show you. This is a win. We're doing pretty good here, and it's obviously hard it's obviously hard to disagree with the Bible when we just read verse 27. God created male and female. It's hard to get around this, and maybe that's where people are going. Number 27 is where a little bit more of the confusion comes about. So number 27, gender identity is a matter of choice, which this is, of course, a hot button issue, and we're going to be touching a little bit on this in a little bit later. But this is where our concerns for the state of Christian theology should come to the surface, because 37% of evangelicals agreed that gender identity is a matter of choice. And I think this just helps us understand in a quick snapshot that there's a lot of confusion both about the creation of male and female, and then also this new sort of wave of ideology in which men and women, and especially young women, or young men even too, are being influenced to quote unquote live out their true gender identity. There's a lot of confusion on that, needless to say. And I would say this, is that gender confusion, I would say, is a result of one's view of man, sin, and salvation getting out of whack. Because if you think about it, if we're going to kind of explain this a little bit, is the fact that all of these things are sort of connected with one another. If you're being taught all of these really insane ideas, that you were born in the wrong body, that you need to do something. That's an anthropological statement. you're making a statement based on your view of humanity when you're being either told or you're telling someone else that, hey, maybe actually you weren't supposed to be born a male, you are supposed to be a female. So your problem then is hamartiology, your view of sin, your view of man's problem isn't sin. Your view of man's problem then is what? Is the way in which you've been oppressed or repressed your true identity. And so then your salvation, your solution to man's problem is you need to go through this process in order for you to live out your truth. All of these things are connected to the same basic thing, that our fellow man's view of themselves is based on crazy solutions. It's based on information that they've gleaned, or perhaps even misinformation that they've been taught about who they are and about what is actually going to fix them. And of course, to me, this just makes me so incredibly burdened for the way in which young people, especially teenagers, are being influenced around the ideas of how to live out their truth, so to speak. And of course, all of this comes out of this movement that's I'm transgender, I'm non-binary, or what have you. All of this, I think, comes back to here. Their view of man, their view of humanity, their view of mankind's origins is out of whack, which means their view of mankind's problem is out of whack, which means they're going to get the solution wrong. The salvation that's being proposed to young men and women is you need to go through a transition. And I think that these are all just, again, false views of anthropology, hamartiology, and soteriology. And this is kind of a planned tangent to talk about a little bit about this, but this is, of course, coming off of the heels of a time period in which everyone this is that sort of postmodern relativistic truth. Your truth is relative to mine. Paul has his truth, and I have my truth, and my truth shouldn't inform Paul's truth, and his shouldn't overbear mine. That's sort of the paradigm that's been happening for a long time. When you have that idea that there is no set defined system or statement of truth, then what happens? Then you have all of this, well, essentially you have chaos. That's what happens. Then that's what all of this is downstream from. And I think that, I'll say this. One of the things that I want to convey too is that this should make us, I'll say it this way. This should make us angry when we hear about how young men and women are being influenced in this way. But I think more than anger, it should make us burdened. To me, that's what happens. Like, okay, so I watched. This is free. Natalie and I, when it was on Twitter a long time ago for free that one time. We watched that documentary put out by Matt Walsh in the Daily Wire. What is a Woman? I don't know if you've watched that. I would recommend it only because it might make you a little bit angry, but I think it should make you burdened. Really, that's what it did. Because you got to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, exactly what their indoctrination language sounds like. It's the indoctrination language of those who are pushing the agenda of the LGBTQ movement, of what they're trying to, what they're teaching, what they're sort of opening young people up to. And all of what it is going to do is just going to make you incredibly sad. But I think in a good way I'm not saying, hey, go home and cry and be sad, but I am saying be burdened for the way in which all of this is broken. What you're seeing is the brokenness and man's resistance and rebellion to who God is. You're seeing it on full display. You know when it talks about in Romans chapter 1 that God has turned them over to a reprobate mind? This is kind of the fruit of that. They pursued their own truth. Mankind has pursued his own ideas of God and who he wants to be, to the point where now we're reaching sort of the apex of all of that, in which man is assuming that he can be his own God to the point where he can change who he is. He can change his identity. And this is all downstream of all that. And I think my point is this, is that it's sad that all of this gets turned into political talking points. Every November, you have the certain candidates, and they're going to make political statements about different sort of things. When really, especially if you watch that documentary, the testimonies of these people that have gone through this and now regret it are some of the saddest stories you will ever read. They're some of the most excruciating testimonies of people who have bought in. They've bought into the lies of false anthropology, of false hamartiology, and false soteriology. And now when they're coming back out of it and they're sort of kind of staring you in the face through a screen, and they're telling you, man, I bought into all of this and it is not what it cracked up to be. What you're seeing is once again man's hope of salvation failing them. You're seeing the false hope of salvation by living out my truth fail. Why? Because that's not what man was created for. It goes back to we have to have a proper and biblical, I would say, understanding of who we are as humans, what our problem is, and how God has designed from the beginning of the world, from creation itself, to fix that problem, to remedy that problem. This is all within his determinate will and counsel. Tiffany, you had a question.
It's a 70% fail rate is what I heard.
Yeah, the fail rate is pretty small, is pretty large, and there's the repercussions are only going to get worse. And I don't mean to turn this into a talking point about this. I will say a lot of what it seems to me it's a huge mental health crisis. More often than not is what we are seeing, which again leads to bad solutions. When you're kind of feeding into that mental health collapse that's happening, but you're feeding it, you're nurturing it, instead of trying to actually fix it or help remedy it. Regardless, my point is this, is that when we see these people, we often might have reactions that are strong. We might have reactions that are very visceral, like, oh, I can't believe that. But more often than not, I would hope that we would, when we see folks who have bought into this, they don't deserve our hatred. They actually deserve our compassion. They deserve our mercy more than anything else. And I think that's sort of one of the things that I think is that we struggle with sometimes. And I should have put it up here, but Pastor Eric mentioned this when he was talking about angels and demons. When Ephesians 6:12, where Paul says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, or against the spiritual forces of evil and heavenly places. That's the fruit. All of this kind of stuff is the fruit of evil getting in the heart of man, and kind of, this is the fruit of it. This is the fruit of mankind living after the flesh. Remember in Galatians chapter 5 where Paul talks about, hey, are you living after the flesh, or are you living after the Spirit? Those who live after the Spirit by faith, they bear fruit that looks like this. And he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, kindness, etc. And then but before that, he contrasts that by talking about the fruit of living after the flesh, which is chaos, it's violence, it's hatred, it's vitriol, it's kind of this right here. And so we're seeing the fruit of all of that. So anyways, this is kind of, I'm saying all this because all of these things that we're talking about this morning, they are so incredibly timely and relevant to where we are. The general population's understanding of humanity is really far off base, and that leads them to make succeeding decisions on how to fix the problem that they perceive as the problem, and where they're going to go for that fix. And more often than not, it's either to some sort of man-made wisdom or to themselves. So anyways, what I want to do is convey and communicate a biblical anthropology, a biblical hamartiology, and a biblical soteriology. I want to show you what the Bible says about who you are, where we came from, what our problem is, and how God in his amazing foresight and wisdom and determination sovereignly chose to fix that problem. So anyways, that's what we're doing. So quick, definitions. Anthropology, big Greek word, essentially just means words or discourses about man, just like logos is that word that means words or study. We often translate it study of, but essentially this is what it means: the study of man, words about man, or we could say words about humanity. That's what anthropology is. And so let's start, we're just going to kind of introduce this a little bit by looking at mankind's origins. And the thing that I want to convey, of course, is that mankind's origins aren't up for debate. They aren't really up for questioning. They are not up for redefinition. They're not sort of things that we need to be worried about in any sort of way, because the Bible tells us exactly where mankind came from. Again, verse 26, Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. This is where we came from. You know, part of the quest for all of these other theories about the origins of the universe, many of the scientific endeavors that have defined humanity, that have won a lot of Nobel Prizes for the last several decades, are all sort of based out of the premise of trying to explain mankind's origins without the existence of God. Most of them are going to fit within that box. How can we explain where we came from and got here with everything that we see around us? Also, not only everything we see, but everything we know and feel about ourselves. How do we explain emotions? How do we explain humor? How do we explain culture? How do we explain art? How do we explain morals without the presence or the existence of an almighty creator and designer and God? That's where a lot of these come from. And I would say, essentially, we can spend some time on this, but really, essentially, all of these other theories don't have merit. We can walk through them if you want, and maybe we'll pick up there on the next time. But we can walk through, the gap theory, the day-age theory, that all those other theories of the way in which the world was created. Because I would say, too, if you're reading Genesis 1 and you're trying to... and I'm not going to say there has to be like a definitive standpoint in this, but you're saying that each of these days is 1,000 years and all that kind of stuff, that actually has implications going forward with what you believe about how the earth was started, which is to say the simple understanding, and it's not simple, but I think it's the most basic understanding, that these are literal 24-hour days, and God created man, and he created the universe within 24 literal hours. That's the best, and I would say the most reasonable and the most biblical explanation going forward for who we are and where we are, and all the ramifications of that. So again, I think it's also incredible that within this book that we know is the revelation of the Son of God, God's only Son, the revelation of the Savior, is also our reason for being. So this book isn't just a book that's all about God. It is, but we could say an ancillary or a secondary application is to show us where we came from and how we fit into that amazing story that God is constantly unfolding. It's the story of creation's redemption. Actually, I think I'm going to stop here, and we're going to jump into this because I want to jump into chapter 2 of Genesis, which actually talks about the image of God in us, actually in a way that actually doesn't even reference that. So I want to talk about chapter 2 verses. So I'm going to give you some homework. Because we're not meeting next week, because next week we have the church picnic. So come back on the 25th of August for part 2 of this, and come back with how would you explain what the image of God is? If you had to explain to someone and you would say, hey, we're all made in the image of God, what does that mean? and what does that look like? Come back with answers or ideas, and I would love to talk about that, because I want to talk about that because that's going to have huge ramifications going forward. But any questions or comments or things that that came to your mind while we are going through some of this morning? Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, I'm curious what Bible version that came out of Genesis 1.
This is the ESV.
So, that's ESV, okay.
Yeah.
NIV and NASB doesn't have us in there. It says
Oh.
God made it in His image, so it doesn't use the plural.
Interesting.
It doesn't have us or our. I thought NASB was one of the more accurate versions according to the original text.
Which,
The reason why I bring that up is because when you use plural us or our, we're not really identifying a gender for God. And therefore, when you get to the end of verse 27 where it says God made in His image, male and female, is this where some of the confusion is coming from? Right, I'm looking at this from an apologetic approach. If I had to defend the Bible against somebody that's indoctrinated with this gender identity stuff, is this where they're coming from, right?
Yeah.
Are they saying us, meaning that God is male and female?
well, and so if you want to open this can of worms, we can. God himself doesn't really have a gender. And that shouldn't be like this amazing statement, because if you just think about it, God is a spirit. He isn't defined by mankind, fleshly, earthly genders. That's why God can talk about himself in the Bible, both through, most often, 95% of the time, how is God the Father revealing himself? As a father. That's why why he is called the Father. But that's also why we understand God's love, like in places like Isaiah, through the love of a mother. Because God is a spirit, and it's insane that we would try to apply human genders to one who is a spirit, who is outside of our realm of existence. But that's the same argument that many will make who are buying into a lot of the gender confusion. They will try to kind of smash those realities. They're going to smash the spirit world into the we could say the human world and say, see, these things don't equate. Well, that's also because God is outside of our realm of existence, and these gender definitions don't apply because he is a spirit. Essentially, it's the same thing that Pastor Eric was talking about with angels. Angels themselves within the spirit world don't have genders. That's why he says there is no marrying and remarrying in heaven. But when they enter into this realm, they take on sort of forms that we could say quote unquote make sense. In which we as humans can interact. Like Genesis 18, God the Father comes, we could say God the Holy, or God the Son, we should say, comes down in Genesis 18 and interacts with angels. And he's interacting with Abraham. He's not just this amoebus light being. No, he comes down as a man. But I definitely understand what you're saying, because I've heard that rhetoric a lot, where they'll take a passage like this or others and they'll try to it's like reapplying something down here to define something up here. But that's starting from the wrong starting point. This is the defining point, and it comes down, not the other way. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? I don't know if that is, hopefully. But I've heard that rhetoric a lot. Eric, do you want to say something? You looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. The whole concept of like male and female is kind of, disregarded, and we're all, genders, whatever you want, is very similar. It's satanic, because even if you look at Baphomet, which is one of the cultural symbols, Baphomet is both, it looks like a male, but it also has female attributes. And it's showing that blending, and basically all Satan does is blurs the lines of God's reality. And exactly what Satan does, he's basically sowing doubt in these people's heads. Just like he did in the garden. Did God really say that? Did God really say you're male and female? Didn't he say that you're genderless when you leave here and you guys are going to be like the angels? And they'll start saying these things, but we live in this reality that male and female exist because God created us to procreate. And that's how he designed man to be manifested in this way, whereas the angels were all made immediately.
Correct.
So when you start denying that male and female thing, because we're going to be genderless later on, now you're starting to defy God's whole process for humanity. And again, the whole reason is it's just satanic, and these people don't even know it. That's why, like you say, we were not against flesh and blood, but spirits, because this ideology actually doesn't even come from humanity.
Yeah.
It comes from the evil one.
Correct.
And he's just trying to mess it up. But male and female is very important as far as Earth goes, and mainly because it's what God said.
Well, that's a great point. Another thing I think on your question too is that I've seen, you know, reels, TikToks or whatever, where they're like, oh, see, it says male and female, he created them, meaning, and we understand this as Adam because by this point Eve hasn't been created yet. But the whole point of this is kind of like that's a false presupposition on what this is trying to convey. Genesis 1 is like a big overbroad summary statement from Moses on how everything came into being. And then when he goes back into chapter 2, that's almost like you're zooming in. It's like you have this map and hey, here's everything, and here's how everything got to where it was. So Moses is, when he's finishing chapter 1, he's already assuming that you know that there's two genders in the world. There's two sexes. It's male and female. And yet when he zooms into chapter 2, he's like, wait, let's go back a second and let's zoom in to when God created man, because I want to spend some time on that. So at the beginning of chapter 2, he's like pinch and zoom on a map on your iPad, and he's saying, here's how that happened. So God didn't create Adam with female chromosomes and then, you know, made Eve from that. No, he made Adam a man, and then in his amazing ability, God took a rib out of Adam and made a woman. That's how it happened. There's no gender confusion here. This is a huge summary statement and then later detail. It's like he's backtracking. Moses is backtracking, so to speak, in terms of chronology. This is not chronological in terms of like, here's how everything happened, blah, blah. Anyways, hopefully you get the point there. Because I've seen that used in the same way. But that's not at all what Moses is conveying. That's not at all what he is trying to communicate. It's actually the exact opposite. So anyways. Questions? Yeah, Bill.
I look at this very simple. God created man and woman. When you're born, God is the creator.
Mm-hmm.
You're not born a man in a woman's body, or a man in a woman's body, or a woman in a man's body. God does not make mistakes.
No.
So you're calling God a liar, a forfeiter, when you're saying, I'm born a man, but I'm in really a woman's body. God did it. God created. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, does not make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So right away they're saying God made a mistake.
Yep.
So it's completely, in my mind, unbiblical, untruth.
And again, all of this comes out of the idea of not wanting to submit to authority. That's a really big thing that you'll find. Like, no one likes to submit to authority. It's like, I'm going to stand up to the man. Well, that's like a human quality, but also it's a quality that gets man into trouble. The idea that we don't want to submit to the authority of who God is, that's leading to all of this. That's the original sin, by the way. It's this believing the lie that we don't have to submit to the authority of who God is. We can make up our own. We can do our own thing. We can be like gods. It's all started from right there. That's where all of this mess started. But thankfully, as we're going to see, that's also where our solution was promised. So think about Genesis 2. Come back on the 25th. And have some ideas or answers for what is the image of God. What does that mean? And I look forward to more conversation. We're going to get into all of this a little bit more. This was just a kind of a segue, an introduction to what we're going to talk about. And we'll dive in more next time.